10 months or so. This was the first panel that Carol and I cooked up after last year's symposium. And I tell them, and beyond simply, rhetoric and reasoning, what other things should we be doing to bring classical education to broader audiences than those who presently have the benefit of it? And before I introduce our very esteemed panel, I just want to acknowledge and thank our sponsor for this afternoon, the Rowe Center for Jewish Classical Education. The Rowe Center is dedicated to building a movement of Jewish classical educators through developing K-12 curricula, cultivating and supporting teachers, and partnering with Jewish schools. Our mission is to raise up new generations of committed Jews who understand and care about the Jewish people's exceptional role in history, who bring Jewish wisdom to the civilizational arena, and who incorporate the best of Western culture into Jewish life. Thank you to the Rowe Center for your generous support. Our first panelist this evening, I'm going to start at the end and work my way back, is Angel Adams-Parham. And Angel is, I'm sure, already known to many of you. She is the Associate Professor of Sociology and Senior Fellow of the Institute of Advanced Studies in Culture at the University of Virginia. And she is passionate about education across the spectrum. Having worked at the college level for many, many years, she has also founded and operated a K-12 school, the Nyanza Classical Community, and before that, homeschooled both her daughters through K through 9, I believe it was. Yes. And has written a number of extraordinary books. The one that I've found most influential on, I think, the K-12 classical movement was the one that came out, was it 2 years ago? The Black Intellectual Tradition, Reading Freedom into Classical Literature, which is an extraordinary work. I heartily recommend it to all of you. In fact, I'm in the happy position of being able to honestly say that I've read at least one of the books of each of our panelists this afternoon, and they're all fantastic. So I can sincerely recommend each of their recent scholarly outputs. Next to Angel is Stephen Wilson, who is a senior fellow at the Pioneer Institute for Public Policy, which is based in Massachusetts. Stephen is an education entrepreneur of decades, a policymaker, a writer. He founded and built Ascend Learning, which was a network of tuition-free liberal arts charter schools in central Brooklyn. And this was a high-performing, gap-closing charter school, and was credited with reversing and closing and indeed reversing achievement gaps of race and income. And his most recent venture is the National Summer School Initiative, which provides accelerated instruction in the wake of the pandemic to 150,000 urban students. Prior to this, Stephen drafted the Massachusetts Charter School Law and helped shape the state's landmark 1993 education reforms. And his first book, Reinventing the Schools, A Radical Plan for Boston, drove the passage of the Massachusetts Charter Law. And his most recent book, the one I implore you all to read, is The Lost Decade, Returning to the Fight for Better Schools in America, which came out last year. Finally, we have Ian Rowe, who I'm sure among this crowd also needs no real introduction. But for those who've not yet had the pleasure, Ian is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, focused on education, upward mobility, family formation, and adoption. And he co-founded Vertex Partnership Academies, a virtues-based international baccalaureate high school in the Bronx. And he is also a co-founder of the National Summer School Initiative, serves as chairman of the board at Spence Chapin, and is a senior visiting fellow at the Woodson Center. And since the 2022 publication of his book, Agency, The 4-Point Plan, Free for All Children to Overcome the Victimhood Narrative and Discover Their Pathway to Power, Mr. Rowe has led the AEI's Free Initiative, which cultivates a deeper understanding of how family, religion, education, and entrepreneurship weave together a moral fabric that shapes and develops agency in children. So if you notice a pattern, we have both people of great scholarly distinction, but also practical wisdom. They've each published extensively, as well as having founded and led, very successful classical liberal schools. So we're in extremely erudite and expert hands here to tackle, I think, one of the more pressing questions that confronts the classical ed community in 2025. So let me start with you, Angel, and then I will invite Stephen and Ian to chime in. But without turning this into a definitional debate, it probably is important for us to reach some consensus about what we mean by classical education. What is it we are trying to, to use a crude sort of market term, sell to broader audiences than presently enjoy it? Would you care to give us your potted definition? What are the non-negotiables and kind of key tenets of classical education?
So starting with the easy questions, I see. So it's good to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. So I think, as a kind of just a quick shorthand, what comes to mind for me is formation in the tradition. And of course, that has to be unpacked quite a bit, but that's the shorthand. And when I think of formation, I think about formation versus information, right? That what you want to have in a classical education is young people being formed as persons to lead a life of goodness and flourishing, and to be able to participate in building a good society. And so that kind of formation has to happen life on life, kind of very embodied. The last panel was on AI, so I think that's very important. And I think you can't really have that, so the tradition part of it, so the formation for what in the tradition, and that's a very capacious word that I think gets at, what over the long term have we as human communities been wrestling over? What have been the big questions? What is a good life? What is a good society? What is justice? What is freedom? And so formation in the tradition then is equipping our students to ask and wrestle with those big questions. And we can have a longer conversation about, okay, how does that boil down to certain kinds of texts? I think that also a non-negotiable is that it's formation using these great texts, and for text I would say written, visual, and sonic text, musical text. And again, we can have a conversation about what are those texts. I think we all have some ideas about what that could look like. And I would also have a kind of a more capacious understanding of what those could be. So I'd say formation in the tradition. And then I would also say building the memory. Now that might seem like a very particular kind of thing. Why would I say building the memory of all kinds of things? Because part of what we want to do in forming our young people is to build their memory and their imagination. And so those beautiful texts, starting with the stories when they're young, the music that they hear, the art that we put before them, forms they keep that in their memory, and it forms their imagination for what does it mean to be a good person, to lead a flourishing life. And so the memory is incredibly important and very closely related to forming the imagination as well.
Stephen, please.
Well, it's hard to top that. That's a fantastic beginning of what is always a very vexing, difficult question. I would just take a few things that you mentioned, Angel, and really emphasize. I think these are schools and must be schools that have an unapologetically intellectual embrace. We live in a country that has a more than 100-year history of anti-intellectualism in education, and I think it's a wonderful invitation for classical or liberal arts schools, and I think that's an important distinction. It'd be fun to, if we have time, to come back to that. I think those things are not entirely synonymously and sit a little uneasily actually next to one another, but this invites you to spar over ideas and to discover how thrilling that is.
And in fact, if you are running a school for 7 to 8 to 9 to 10 hours per day, whether you like it or not, you are in the moral formation business, right? And either you're intentional and deliberate with that responsibility or you're not. But if you're not, that vacuum is still going to be filled. It's going to be filled by other forces that are probably not aligned with the core virtues that you'd like to really have your students embrace. So I was really excited by this panel because we are getting at this question of how do we bring these elements of intellectual rigor, virtue formation to students who don't normally have access. And look, magically, everyone's now seeing the cardinal virtues. So Vertex Partnership Academies is a virtues-based international baccalaureate public charter high school in the Soundview section of the Bronx. And Soundview is a lovely community, but unfortunately, only about 7% of kids who start ninth grade in this school district graduate from high school ready for college 4 years later. And most educators, when they think about bringing a school to Soundview, they're focused on, well, these kids, they just need basic literacy, this kind of elite virtue or classical education. That's not for these kids, right? That's kind of the unfortunate refrain. And so we had a deliberate effort to build this school specifically in this community because that's the attitude that often accompanies folks who are, if they're considering launching a school at all. So one of the first decisions we made was to organize the school around the 4 cardinal virtues of courage, justice, temperance, and wisdom. And certainly for the people in this room, the word cardinal and cardinal virtue, cardinal comes from the Latin root cardo, which means hinge. And so, all other standards of moral excellence emanate from these core virtues, right? So gratitude, perseverance, optimism, determination, all of those emanate from these 4. So every morning we have rituals, and in fact our entire school is organized around these virtues. So imagine our students in their beautiful blazers and ties, and this is primarily low-income Black and Hispanic students. Every morning, for courage, I reject victimhood and boldly persevere, even in times of uncertainty and struggle. Or temperance, I lead my life with self-discipline because I am responsible for my learning and behavior. And the idea is that we make these virtues not just words, but ultimately habits of mind, because we think this is the foundation for leading a flourishing life and the precursor to the intellectual rigor that then follows once kids absorb these virtues.
Ian, thank you. You've somewhat anticipated my next question in how you've illustrated your elaboration there, but I think all 3 of you have alluded to, I guess, 2 strands, one being intellectual rigor and being unapologetic about that, and also being entirely comfortable with moral formation being a preeminent purpose of a K-12 education. Both of those things, as I think all of you alluded to, are somewhat countercultural right now. They, not in this room, but beyond it, they certainly are. So how do we overcome that squeamishness about, moral formation? How do we overcome, as you put it, Stephen, more than 100 years of sort of anti-intellectual tradition when we're trying to enlist newcomers to what we're offering? Let me throw to you first, Angel, and then we'll proceed up the panel with contributions.
Sure, yeah, I think that's an interesting question, and my sense of it, and I'll be interested to hear what my fellow panelists think, is that parents are much less concerned about moral formation, right? Kind of when you are, in the field, struggling with your kids who you want to listen, you want them to grow well, you want them to flourish well. I don't think most parents have a problem with that. I think what happens is that we, and I take some blame for this coming from the academy, you kind of go to higher education, you get certain kinds of theories about how things should be, right? And those theories are not always well kind of in line with reality. And so the theories can sound, I love theory. I dwell in theory, but I also live in the real world and work with real people. And I think it can reach a point where there's this pushback of, okay, moral formation, according to whose morality, right? You know, we get into these kind of philosophical debates, right? But I have a kind of simple mind. I don't think it's that hard. You know, I think there is a lot that we can agree on, right? We do want young people to learn how to live according to these cardinal virtues, right? You know, we can have a high-flown conversation about justice, but we all have a very keen sense of when we've experienced an injustice, and we do not want to live in a world where it's a free-for-all and people can do anything. So I think, you know, at the end of the day, we need to get to parents, and we need to kind of get this education before parents, because I think the parents want it. And so there's got to be a way for the parents to be able to lobby for this education until educational leaders feel that they have no choice but to provide it.
Yeah, if I can just add to that, I think the timing of all of this is exquisite, meaning that I think that there is a hunger out there for exactly this. And I would just argue that if we think of the cultural moment that we're in, where we have been, by virtue of the tech industry, especially social media, we've become hyper-polarized, so divided, set against one another, and of course, great fortunes are made pitting one against another. And I think that what this kind of education can provide is a way out of that, where we're able to see our common humanity, and to also see that the behavior of many of our leaders falls dramatically short of the kinds of virtues that we would expect of them. So while I love Ian's choice of virtues, I wish we could squeeze in their honor, because I think that's a particular one that is at risk, right? When we've descended into this level of absolute vulgarity of public discourse and naked anger and hostility and everything else. I could go on. We all know what I'm talking about, I think. We want to be pulled up to something higher. So that's why I think this is actually a great opportunity to just own this idea that we're going to explicitly, if not teach these values didactically, teach them through great books and through readings where we can see what these things actually mean in practice and how they lead to the kind of flourishing that we're talking about. I think the moment is right.
Yes, and actually, may I, if it's possible to bring up that slide again of the virtue. A couple of things. So one is, Angel, I absolutely agree that parents, we find parents are the most excited when we say we have a deliberate approach to moral formation, and this is what we're talking about. You know, our parents want their school to be an ally in helping their children become good people. And they're so surprised that we take this position, because a few of the other schools that they're talking, the other schools are talking about reading and math scores, and of course that's important, right? But when we get to matters of the soul, I think our parents are very excited. But you guys did mention this idea of, one of the risks of saying that we are deliberate about moral formation does then beg the question, whose morals? For eons, right? So there's a basis upon which we say this, we're not only focused on deliberate virtues formation, but here's exactly what it is. We now live in a context where this word indoctrination is used frequently. Oh, you're indoctrinating kids, you're telling kids what to think versus not how to, versus how to think. And we actually use the word indoctrination. We are indoctrinating kids, right? We are indoctrinating kids.
How's that going?
No, for us, because we're indoctrinating your kids into these virtues, these habits of minds. We're not indoctrinating you in terms of how you need to think on particular political or social issues, but there is a way to think about how to lead your life. And we are trying to indoctrinate you into that fashion of thinking.
Can I just follow up on that? So, so that question about whose morality, genuinely good question. But I think what comes to mind, when I hear that question, is C.S. Lewis's approach to this in The Abolition of Man. It's a wonderful, very slender volume. I'm sure many here are familiar with it. And what he argues there is that there's remarkable agreement across the traditions of humanity, across time, place, and culture. There are important differences too, but there's a lot of overlap, in terms of what it means to treat others with respect, what it means to be a good person. And so, I think that there are many places for overlap. And so the cardinal virtues, are particularly well spelled out in the Western tradition, but there are echoes in other traditions, right? And so having a diverse school, I'm sure you find that even if people, aren't familiar, with the Greek intellectual heritage, those virtues make sense, even if they might be coming from a completely different tradition or culture. So that's the first thing I'd say, is that sometimes I think that there is this sense that we're so completely different. And while there are differences, there's a lot of overlap there. And so I think we don't want to lose sight of that overlap.
Yeah, it is interesting, and again, I'll beg for the slide to come back up just one more time. When in our first year, we adopted these 4 cardinal virtues without definitional statements, right? So it's just courage, justice, temperance, and wisdom. And what we soon discovered was what one person thought of courage could be completely different from that of another student or faculty member. Sometimes courage meant I won't back down if I'm in a fight and I'm ready to throw down. Or for some kids, it could be, having the bravery to answer a question when they weren't sure if they knew the answer. So we ultimately decided, at least for our school, we wanted to define these what we call these I statements. And it is, so for us, we did want to create commonality for what, at least in our school, what these virtues meant. And so we wanted to make the implicit explicit. And so Stephen, when you said earlier, we're living in a time where even, our leaders are not demonstrating respect and honor, the virtue of justice, I uphold our common humanity and honor the inherent dignity of each individual. Our hope is that over time, if our students really absorb that language, it becomes really hard to demonize someone based on superficial characteristics like race or gender or political affiliation, because you hold this inherent dignity. So if it's someone with whom I disagree, you're not an inherently bad person. I just disagree with your argument. So that's how we try to use the specificity of the virtue in these conversations.
I'm going to indulge Ian and his slide a little bit longer, only because it's helpful to the direction I want to take us in. One of the things I notice about this is how sort of practically these things are rendered. These are, it's a simple, relatable language. And I see our good friend Eric Twist in the audience here. He wrote a piece some months ago lamenting what he called high tongue and high gait tendencies in the classical community, where, by high tongue meaning we tend towards verbosity or more obscure language. Classical education has a very developed patois. We talk about the paideia and the trivium and things like that, all of which is fantastic, but is perhaps not immediately accessible to new audiences and the sorts of people that perhaps all 3 of you have worked with in your practical capacities as school leaders. So I want to invite each of you to lean on that practical side of your biography and get into the weeds, because I think all of us readily sign up to the idea that classical education is for everyone. We want to open the doors wide to, anyone who sincerely seeks it is welcome. It's when you get into the weeds of, well, what does that look like? Actually write the note of invitation for me in black and white, that we get into some of these trickier questions. So Stephen, you seem poised to fire on this,
Well, I kind of am.
Go
Yeah.
for it.
So I would just like to start with some very practical, basic things, right? So we all saw, I hope, Doug Lemov's session this morning. We know that the largest problem in American education, K-12 that is the consistent underestimation of what kids are capable of. Most of the tasks, a beautiful study that showed this by TNTP, most of the tasks placed in front of students, especially students of color from low-income families, are way below what they're capable of doing. So I would begin first off with this idea that we're going to have very elevated expectations of what kids are going to do, and we're going to pledge to only put grade level or higher tasks in front of them. So it's a very practical beginning, but of enormous importance. And then we're going to work systematically to build word and world domain knowledge from which we can then build the kind of understanding of rich texts that Lemov did such a beautiful job of describing. So I think that's just a really important, just aiming high with beautiful writing, beautiful, engaging text, the beauty of math. Now, where I may differ a little bit with some other exponents of this kind of education is the religious dimension and how that could alienate some audiences. So here, I've probably been too provocative already, but we might want to come back to that at some point.
We're a
I'd love
broad
to hear
tent
that.
conference, Stephen.
Sorry?
I said we're a broad tent conference.
Oh, you want me to say more? Yeah. Oh, okay. Well, I think, I was hoping I didn't have to. But no, I think that there is a tension, I think, maybe even a contradiction between the liberal arts dimension of aiming to foster cosmopolitans, right? People that are intrigued by diverse cultures, interested in other people from other parts of this world, and encouraged to see their common humanity. I think that is in tension to some degree with a kind of Western chauvinism that is inherent in classical education. And I think that's a problem and one we really need to wrestle with. And then if you add on top of that the specifically religious language, the ceaseless invocation of the Lord or heaven and so on, while I entirely respect that those are deep-seated commitments and virtuous commitments of many people, they will alienate a vast swath of people we really need to reach.
Yeah, so I mean, I think this is part of where I live in terms of, kind of when I first started to get into classical education and was homeschooling, we were living in an inner city New Orleans neighborhood. And I wanted to invite the young people in that neighborhood into this education. And so that raises this very practical question. What does classical education have to do with the mom struggling to feed her kids? And those parents would talk to me and say, I see what's going on with your kids and mine are struggling to read. And so there was a very practical sense of what can we do to intervene? And that we would start the kids out, and I would say these kids they were all coming from public to, kind of be luring them away. Like, I hope this is not, kind of problematic, that they're all going to want to stay here. But we didn't have a problem, and so we would go up, but we made things very accessible, right? And so this is what launched the curriculum writing that we do, is wanting to kind of bring in a very user-friendly way, but still very high level. So we're going to read Homer's Iliad, and then we're going to do a visual study with Romare Bearden's Black Odyssey, and then we're going to have you make art in the style of Romare Bearden. And so that is, and for those who don't know Romare Bearden, Google Black Odyssey, the most beautiful artistic renderings you can imagine, retelling the Odyssey through African diaspora eyes. And so he's retelling various stories. There's a whole series of panels on it. We'd have them write poetry, and we put together a beautiful booklet of their poetry. So there are ways to make this very accessible. We also organize everything around virtues, and so they're getting the virtues. So I'll come now to the religious language that Stephen brought up, because I think it is true that in classical circles, there's a very large proportion of Christians in classical education, and so that's where you will hear a lot of that language. And the way that we've approached this in our program in Yonsei Classical Community, we do have a lot of Christians using the curriculum, but I also introduce this to non-Christians by saying, you know, there is such a thing as studying the Bible as literature, right? It doesn't mean that you've got to believe everything in it, but part of what I think a classical education does is to help us to literally be on the same page. And so for a Western audience like us, I'd say it helps to just know those biblical stories, you know, because it's hard to study much of what's in the canon if you haven't had any exposure. I mean, everyone up through Toni Morrison, you know, and this is one of the things that I love about the Black intellectual tradition, right? So if you are trying to read Toni Morrison, you're going to have a very robust background in the classics of Western civilization, in African American culture and history. You're going to need to be able to blend those together. You could easily read, I remember when I was reading Song of Solomon, I had to read it 3 times to really get all of the different levels and, you know, already having much of that background, but you could read it and have no idea what you're missing, you know. And so I think even if it's just a matter of kind of cultural literacy, but I agree we want a wider tent, right? We do want a wider tent of people who are coming from many different backgrounds. And then I'll just close with this, that I think there's also a way of thinking in terms of cultural integrity across traditions, right? So I've got a colleague at UVA in religious studies, Oludamini Ogunaika, who has a really wonderful piece online called Of Canons and Canons, the 2 spellings of canons. And he comes from West Africa, and he argues that the problem in Western countries and in post-colonial settings like his in West Africa, what he is seeing is that young people have no tradition. And this is the problem. And so what he argues for is not a shallow diversity sprinkling, and not, you know, a kind of just washing over in a very Eurocentric understanding of the West, but that you need to really, in all of its integrity, teach young people the Western tradition and their own tradition, wherever that comes from, so that they're bilingual. And then I lied, one more thing. So on the Western tradition, my understanding of this is that it's quite a lot more capacious than it's made to seem in classical circles. When we are looking at the Greeks and the Romans, they are at the Mediterranean crossroads. And it's very hard for me to see how they've risen out of the ocean separate from that crossroads. Like, I just don't understand it. In the work I do in historical sociology, we look at large swaths of history to understand, you know, particular phenomena. And so, you know, I'm reading classicists, medievalists, you know, modernists, and I'm just not seeing this isolated Greece and Rome that I too often encounter in classical circles. In the medieval period, you know, that kind of intricate connection between Christian, Jewish, and Islamic scholars, the House of Wisdom of Islam, bringing us much of what we know about algebra. I'm not seeing it, you know, and so I don't have a problem with studying the West, but can we study the West? You know, because you can't study the West without studying these other cultures that have contributed to it.
Wow, there's so much great stuff, what both of you just said. As far as the religious piece, you know, as someone who runs a public charter school, you know, I'm very cognizant of you know, how close to the line we can get in terms of explicit religious instruction, but we often get around it by this point of religion as literature, as a mechanism to understand Western culture. And I did want to quote, because this question about, how do we make this really accessible, classical education? I wrote a piece recently called "The Best for the Best is the Best for All," and I quoted from University of Chicago President Maynard Robert Hutchins almost a century ago, and he said that until recently, the Western world regarded it as self-evident that the road to education lay through great books. No man was considered educated unless he was acquainted with the masterpieces of Western literature. There was never much doubt about which the masterpieces were. They were the books which had stood the test of time and had continued to be acclaimed as the finest creations in writing of the Western mind. And he concluded, the best education for the best is the best education for us all. And so I really love that language, because sometimes even the language we use can be a deterrent. So we don't always say classical education is what we're doing for your kids. We're going to expose you to the best education that has been provided to the most elite kids in our society. So you move away from the labels, which actually might be, create a wall, and just say, no. There is something that's been recognized as the best for the best, and your children are now going to be exposed to that.
Wonderful, Ian, thank you. I want to pick up on something that Angel said, and this will be the last question from the chair. So if you have a burning question in the audience, please compose it as lucidly as you can, and with a rising inflection at the end, and I'll invite you to the microphone in just a moment. But before I do, you alluded to the fact, Angel, that sometimes in the classical movement there is a unduly narrow, ahistorical understanding of the Western tradition, and insufficient appreciation of the fact that it's a thoroughly synthetic thing that draws on, many diasporas, civilizations, etc. And I wonder if the kind of mirror image of that is a misperception in the broader populace about what is meant. And so I wanted to use that as a jumping off point to invite each of you to opine briefly on what you think are some of the biggest misconceptions that we have to tackle in trying to reach some of these.
Some of them coming out of the classical education movement, who were saying, I'm starting a new school, but we're not going to call it classical, but we're going to basically use all of what classical is. It concerns me, because I think more people, I think you can't really be formed in this way of teaching without having the community, right? So this community is very nourishing. I came out of homeschool, classical homeschool. It was the homeschool moms who told me, you should read this, you should go to that conference. I can't conceive of how to do this outside of a community, really. It's hard to wrap your brain around it without having that community. And so if we really are serious about wanting all children to have the best of the best, as you said, Ian, we need to find a way to speak to and invite people, and to really be inviting without giving up the essence of who we are. So I'm not saying we should, do cartwheels and redefine who we are, but the language you were using, Ian, reminded me of Anna Julia Cooper, and her argument that, teachers from across time have gleaned what is the essence of a great education. And she was a classical educator at heart and fought for it at the end of the 19th and into the beginning of the 20th century for African Americans, when the turn was toward industrial education, that you people don't really need this, right? Industrial education is good enough for you. And so Anna Julia Cooper, W.E.B. Du Bois, and many others fought very hard. And so it's particularly sad and ironic that we're now at this strange pass that, oh no, that's not for us. It's kind of like you just did the work for all of the people of the past who underestimated you. Like, you've kind of let them win because they said this wasn't for you, and now you're embracing that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. That particular aspect of Black history is so important. So I just want to emphasize maybe some of the pitfalls, right, of how we promote. I think that there has been such an instrumental conception of education, right? So it's going to be about, can I get a good job? And people will look at classical education and say it's esoteric, it's elitist. How is my child going to make an income and prosper? And I think we should take that on just fully, and maybe in two distinct respects. First, to refute it empirically, which I almost never hear, which is that liberal arts graduates, over the course of a lifetime, not in the first couple of years, make more money than people educated in a technical or a specialized way. And I think we need to really get out front there. Another aspect of that, or beautiful illustration of that, is the massive, pervasive enthusiasm for teaching students how to code, right, of 10 years ago. We've seen the pitfall of that because, in fact, coding is the first thing to be replaced by machines, by AI. So trying to play that game of what narrow skill do we impart for our graduates is a loser's proposition, which brings me to the second part, which is really to emphasize that this is our moment to recognize that AI poses an enormous threat to the very kind of formation that we have been describing. For all of us that have spent any time on GBT and watched how it gets better every month, I mean, it's truly extraordinary. This is just going to turn everything upside down. And what this kind of education, I would prefer to call it a liberal arts education than a classical education, but that gets us back to nomenclature, is to preserve what is uniquely human and to ensure that every child is equipped with that unique human capacity. And that's the ability to seek out truth, to wrestle with competing propositions, to approach others with generosity, to see someone on the other side of the room or the other side of the earth as also being human. And I think that's what our education is especially good at doing and urgently needed right now.
Ian, please take the last word while we wait for our audience members to give you curly questions.
Right. Well, I would just say that we're in the early stages of designing a new classical, virtues-based high school. And this school will have an industry focus on aviation and aerospace. And I've often described this to folks, they're saying, wow, how can that be? These two things are incongruous, right? If we need career and technical education schools, and so how does a classical education fit into that? It reminds me, I did a testimony in Congress last year, and it was a hearing on career and technical education, how that maps to human flourishing, and one of the senators was saying, look, we need more plumbers. We don't need more philosophers, we need more plumbers. And I said, well, it would be great if we had more plumbers that have studied philosophy, yes. Right? And so the idea is, how do we have a core education that, you know, if we're high school, secondary, is a 4-year course of study in a core classical education, right? And then if your high school then has the aspiration to have some kind of industry focus, that's a great thing. But the point is, this should be an education accessible to all, and not that you have to make a choice between getting what is a good education, the best of the best is best for all, can coexist also with our aspirations around industry. And one quick point on the AI front, it actually has been amazing to watch ChatGPT develop, Grok, Claude, Anthropic, and there are lots of different examples when the same question, the same prompt is posed to each of these. There was one just last week. You know, if you had to choose between misgendering an individual and like catastrophic world war, I think Anthropic said you can't misgender. No, and look, and I don't want to get into trans policy right now, but what I'm saying is that you can even see, because all of these folks who are doing this are brilliant engineers. Like the people who are developing these AI tools are quite sophisticated technically, but it does show that what the underlying sort of ideology of their mindset heavily influences what we're going to be seeing in terms of what artificial intelligence is producing.
Thanks, Ian. I'm going to open up for questions now, so please approach the microphone if you have one. Identify yourself if
Courage
you feel
is
inclined.
the first virtue.
While we wait for our first questioner, just a data point that supports what both of you have been saying, actually, I think it was the New York Fed recently put out employment statistics by different majors. And interestingly enough, anthropologists and philosophers and other liberal arts graduates are being employed at far higher rates right now than computer scientists. They may be working as baristas, I don't know, but...
No, I think they're working as executives, right?
Yes,
and
yes,
as managers.
yes. This was entry-level first job
But
out of
they're on
school.
their way
But
towards
they may
that
well
with
be
those
on their
skills.
way,
Yeah.
yeah. So the Fed supports you in your empirical defense, Stephen. I can't believe no one has stepped forward.
Here we go.
Here we go.
That's the prompt right there. Excellent.
In the name of courage, Ian, thank you so much. I have been fascinated with your school model for several years now as I've watched it grow. What I'd love to ask you is, how do you teach that definition of courage? And specifically, what I'm thinking about is, how do you do this in a way that's psychologically healthy? Right? Because there's this element of, you say you reject victimhood, but what if true trauma has been experienced, and ignoring that trauma or that suffering? I'm just wondering, how do you navigate that?
We're not developing naive students or who believe they're entering a world where everything's nirvana and that they actually won't face real challenge. So in courage, where it says, I reject victimhood, there's a very important clause that goes after that, right? Which is boldly persevere even in times of uncertainty and struggle. So we spend a lot of time with our students on this particular virtue, because it's often the one that gets the most attention, which is that life is hard. You're going to face challenges. You're going to face challenges for a whole myriad of reasons. Some of them might be because of superficial characteristics, like your race or your gender or your economic class, or you might get cancer. Who knows what each person's individual challenge will be? And so we like to spend a lot of time thinking about this idea that I can still persevere. You can be victimized without seeing yourself as a victim. And it seems like a minor distinction, but we spend a lot of time drawing out that distinction. And then, as Stephen said, there's so many pieces of literature that we incorporate. The easy ones are Martin Luther King. We have a series on Booker T. Washington that he had a series of lectures every Sunday night when he was running Tuskegee University. These 5 to 10 minute lectures where he talked to his students, all black students, about responsibility and courage and moving forward even in the face of adversity. And the words in those, and I would encourage anyone to pursue them because they're beautiful, and every single word is still relevant today. So we can bring that literature to our students and say, look, this is what Booker T. Washington was writing about 100 plus years ago, when conditions, in this case for black people, were far worse than they are today. And here were strategies of thriving that he is focused on. So it's not, so I really appreciate the question. So it's not just about willy-nilly, oh, I reject victimhood. No, sometimes there's real trauma, real adversity, but the whole point is that every single person is going to face that adversity. How do we develop strategies for you to overcome? And I believe in a classical education, you can go to stories that get at the essence of humanity. That it doesn't have to be a black kid that is the kid, you know, the person that you're reading about. You could read Shakespeare and also get the same message about how a person, a human, has overcome adversity.
Thank you. My name is Catherine Kuiper. I'm from Hillsdale College. And I'm wondering about the use of the term Western civilization. And if I'd be just love to hear from each of the panelists if you think that term is, if it obscures more than it reveals. Because I was noting the comments made about Greece not existing in isolation. My husband's a history teacher and talks about this all the time, that the Greek world really was, it was spreading out through East Asia. It was in India. That the world that gave Greece the religious and philosophical content that developed into their civilization is coming from India and Egypt, and that when we use this term Western civilization, there's kind of maybe a possibility of obscuring those origins and regarding Greece as a kind of inexplicable miracle that then just gets carted over to Europe and then inexplicably is just very successful. Anyway, so what do you guys think about Western civilization? Do we need a different name? Is that name helpful or not?
I'll gladly go first. I love that you brought this up. I think it is problematic. I mean, obviously we come from a Western tradition, but again, I go back to this idea that if we want to create people who are children, people of the world, not just of America, but people that are comfortable in a global society, who are truly cosmopolitan, who want to be exposed to the ideas and enthusiasms of people all around the world, why would we draw this border around a particular geography and a particular tradition? And I will also say that there are tremendous, truly cataclysmic risks to doing that. And I would just name one, which is think of, and I don't mean to be political, my point is not expressly political, but think of George Bush and the forever wars. And his conception, his naive conception that he could import, that he was such a triumphalist of American thought that he thought he could bring it to a foreign part of the world and prevail. And the consequence was hundreds of thousands of dead and trillions of dollars of losses and nothing to show for it. So I think a little humility in our intellectual tradition, a little bit more curiosity about other cultures and ideas would be a lovely enhancement to classical education.
I would just push back a little in that, right, you do ultimately want to get to the point where our students have a exposure to a broad level of traditions, Eastern, Western, but it does feel like it's sequential, not necessarily cumulative or all at the same time.
Don't you have to start somewhere? Is that what you're saying, Ian?
Yes. I don't know if you would push back against that.
No,
But
I think I agree with you on that, yeah. But I would be very careful about stopping at a particular point, and I would be very careful about erasing all the wrongs that those traditions have resulted in.
Of course, yes.
And I think that if we fail to speak to those wrongs, which are immense, we will alienate so many people we could win over.
And would you draw that line at K-12 education versus higher ed? Meaning...
Oh, no, I think starting in kindergarten we can be honest about America's wrongs. I see no problem with them.
No, yes. I'm talking about this idea of just...
Oh, when you introduce the other cultures, yeah. Well, I mean, I think you could be reading Persian love poetry in middle school. Why not? It's fabulous.
Angel, please weigh in.
Sure. Yeah. So I really appreciate the question. So I think it's a very nuanced approach that we need to take. I mean, I think it's very important to bring out the different strands that have contributed to what we understand to be the West today. So I don't know that I would necessarily get rid of Western, just because it's, I don't know, part of it's a kind of like, at least it gives us a conversation, it gives us a place to start, and there is something clearly different about the Western world as it's evolved than, say, Chinese civilization. Like, we're not talking about Chinese civilization, right? And the West and its kind of experience with say, modernity and the Enlightenment and how that has been then kind of imposed on other places. Like there is a particular kind of cultural constellation there, and I think what I try to do with my students that I teach is I'm trying to help them understand what's happened in the West. Like, what is it that's brought us to where we are, which is arguably a kind of nihilistic, place that's kind of dark. But you need to study the whole thing to really get that. But in terms of the beginning, as the person asked, sorry, I forgot your name. Catherine. As Catherine was saying, I think it's a matter not necessarily of getting rid of the name Western, but it is, as your husband has said, relentlessly bringing that out so that there's no way for people to get through a K-12 classical education and be talking about Greece and Rome as if they rose out of the water by themselves. That should be impossible. And then when I am in my Christian circles, what I say is the history of the church, profoundly Middle Eastern and North African in its earliest years, right? You would never know if you were growing up in the United States, at least the people that I know and me having grown up, you would think it just kind of, again, sprung up out of the loins of Western Europe. But that is just not the case. And so I think if we are doing our work properly, then it should be especially children coming from a K-12 classical education who are able to draw out in a very nuanced and sophisticated way the kind of cultural crossroads that has spawned what is today called the West.
We have time for one last question. The gentleman's been waiting very, very patiently, so thank you. Last question, and then we'll wrap.
Yeah, hi everybody. Forgive my voice. And what role do they play? Are they core tenets to a classical education?
Certainly from our perspective, so these virtues, which thankfully you've left up on the screen. So we have these, a daily ritual where our students recite each of the I statements for these virtues, and our students recite the preamble to the Constitution each morning. We the people have the responsibility of securing the blessings of liberty. And so for us, that is a very powerful part of our story. You have to believe you live in a good country, a good, if not great country, a country that is not hostile to your dreams. So that's one of the mechanisms by which we remind our kids every single day that in the same way those words, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, those are the mechanisms by which we have become a better country. And you within yourself, if you believe in these virtues, if you believe in that preamble, you yourself have the same tools of self-betterment and self-improvement in you, and your country can help in that endeavor. It's not a hostile effort.
So by the time I get them in college, Ian, this has not happened usually. And so what I tend to get is young people who are fairly jaded about what it means to be American. And I think that's a problem. But I think part of what's going on is that perhaps they've come through a K-12 education where either it hasn't been well addressed, or they've gotten a kind of triumphalist narrative that then they get to college and they say, wait, they've been lying to me. And so I think it's really important to be very careful about how we teach young people K-12. And I think it can be done in very simple ways. So I remember when I was homeschooling my daughters, and I've integrated this into other curricular work I've done, we read the Little House series, for instance, make it very simple, right? I love the Little House series, right? But you see Native Americans on the periphery as a kind of scary group of people, right? And so I would just take a moment to dwell on that. Well, what's going on in this situation? It's not meant to be a kind of a critical takedown of Laura Ingalls Wilder. It's just a, let's talk about this. And then let's read that together with Louise Erdrich, a Native American woman who has a lovely novel called The Birch Bark. house, which is from the perspective of a Native American child seeing Western settlers coming in. And so reading them in kind of conversation with each other allows a very gentle way to kind of have those conversations from early on. And again, that's very different than having, bringing a hypercritical lens to the elementary school classroom, which is not what I'm talking about. But the reason that it's so important to get that right at an age-appropriate way, where, as Ian is saying, yes, you are proud to be American, and you're also looking honestly at what has been the hard history, but it's a very delicate balance to strike, is because if you don't do it, then what you get is what I get. And I've had a number of conversations recently where I've said, well, we're in the 250th. Is this a good experiment? Like, is this something worth keeping? What do you think? Is liberal democracy worth fighting for? What about the words of the Declaration? And not everyone, but I would say a too large a proportion are saying it's never been good. Because of, they were lying from the beginning, they didn't incorporate Native Americans, there was genocide, there was slavery, and it's very hard at that point to get them to tease apart ideals worth striving and fighting and dying for, and the inevitable darkness of humanity. And just because there is darkness in humanity doesn't mean that we can't have ideals to fight for. And this is where I do think the Black intellectual tradition and the Black historical reality is so important. Because there you have so many exemplars who have fought hard and who believe in those ideals and believe in being American, but who don't hide that past and who I think have struck that very delicate balance that we need to.
Do I dare invite you to take the last word after that tour de force, Stephen?
Well, I would just agree and say, even if you read nothing more in, say, the 10th grade than the James Baldwin essay in The Fire Next Time My Dungeon Shook, you would get that balance and that curiosity that you're describing. So I think it's very doable, what you're describing.
Sadly, we have to leave that there. I imagine we could continue for hours in this vein, and I imagine there may also be questions among the audience, and perhaps our panelists will be gracious enough to stick around for a few minutes afterwards if you have a burning question you want to put to them. But let me say one more word of thanks to our sponsor, the Lobel Center, who have been very generous in their support and have also tolerated Ian's commandeering of the slide real estate. So thank you again to the Lobel Center. And please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists this afternoon, Angel Adams, Parham, Stephen Wilson, and Ian Rowe.